what were you going to do? Were you going to slit your wrist? He said, no, I had a loaded gun next to me. But, we didn't have the term PTSD. I knew that the war had changed him, and that was about as far as it went.
G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Following on in our series on PTSD, we now begin to speak to war veterans about their PTSD journeys. My guest today is Carol Schultz, a daughter of a World War II veteran who had PTSD following the war. Carol's father, Dutch Schulz, enlisted in the army in 1942 following the Pearl Harbor attacks. Dutch is best remembered as being depicted in the 1962 film The Longest Day, a movie made about D-Day, a battle in which Dutch fought in as a part of the 82nd Airborne Division. After returning from the war, Dutch took back with him also what would become known as PTSD, a condition which was unknown at the time. Carol wrote about her experiences as a daughter of a World War II vet going through PTSD in her book, The Hidden Legacy of World War II, A Daughter's Journey of Discovery. Carol is here today on the line to share her and her father's journey. Hello, Carol, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Hello, it's really good to speak with you.
What was your father's early life like?
My father was born in Phoenix, Arizona, to World War I veterans. He had three younger siblings. He was extremely athletic, played three sports, also boxed in Golden Gloves. Graduated from high school in Detroit in 1941 with the idea that he was going to go to college on a baseball scholarship because his big dream was to be a professional baseball player. He spent the summer after graduation in the Civilian Conservation Corps in New Mexico. And then, December 1941, his plans changed. He volunteered. I guess he went in about January or February of 42. And he was initially stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, anti-aircraft unit, because his mother had gone down with him to the recruiting station and said she wanted him in something safe. But, of course, after a while, he just volunteered for the paratroopers.
So he didn't see combat straight away?
Not right away, no. I think by 43, he volunteered maybe in the early summer of 43. His first taste of combat was D-Day. He said paratrooper training was really difficult. Long hikes with a lot of equipment on your back. A lot of people washed out. I mean, not everyone who volunteered made it. And he said it was really hot. I think that he trained at Fort Benning, and they called it like the frying pan days. I think he told me because it was so hot down there. And he said that the first time he practice jumped out of the plane, he fainted. So
okay.
He didn't remember anything until he hit the ground. And he said that some of the other paratroopers just loved to jump, and he said every time he did, he was scared to death, but he was going to do it anyhow because that was his job, and he signed up for it. And one of the big things he always told me is feel the fear but overcome it, but do it anyway.
Did he ever share with you his experiences he had on D-Day?
As a child, no. I knew he was a paratrooper because he wore an 82nd Airborne ring. When my sister and I were children, he would have us, his game was to have us stand at attention and then march around the house, hut 2, 3, 4, and then at ease. So, we sort of knew. And he was also still in the service. When I was a child, he was Army counterintelligence. He never really talked about anything except maybe a few funny stories. And when I first became aware of his D-Day, The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan came out. I read about him in the book, read about his D-Day in the book. A couple years later, the film came out, and they had premieres in different cities, across America, and Philadelphia was one of the places for the premiere. And I remember going to the premiere with him, and there were some generals there, and I remember Paul Anka was there. They had my dad up on stage. But, seeing the war in black and white and seeing The Longest Day, I really didn't comprehend what it was really like. That was my image of my dad's war. Black and white, he was lost, and that was it. That wasn't the truth, honestly. Part of it was true. I'd say 75% of it was true, but honestly, it wasn't until I saw Saving Private Ryan that I really got a real sense of what his war was like. His PTSD wasn't diagnosed then because they didn't have a diagnosis until 1980. But he struggled with alcoholism. He met a second wife in an alcohol rehab center, I guess, when I was about 15 or 16. One night, I guess they had a big fight. He had been married to her for maybe 6 months, and he called our house. And I think he wanted to speak with my mother, and my mother was out, and I answered the phone, and he was sobbing and crying, and he was very drunk at that point. And he said to me that his wife, his name at that point was Ardell, had slit her wrist, and she was bleeding in the bathtub, and that he was going to join her because he had been the failure. And he said he was saying he was crying. He said I was a horrible father, and which he wasn't. I mean, when he was home with my mother, he was a very good father, and I think he basically after the divorce is when he just really started to hit bottom. And I was saying that, no, you weren't. He kept saying, I missed the boat. And my mom walked in and she got on the phone with him and said, I talked him down first. Maybe my mom didn't come in. I think my mom came in about 2 minutes later, and then she called back, and she called his best friend. It was a paratrooper buddy from World War II who lived in the area. It was very close to him, and he went down to the apartment in Center City, Philadelphia. By that point, his wife had been taken away by ambulance. She survived, but then she was sent to a psychiatric hospital. My dad's friend Joe put him on a plane out to California where his parents were living then, and that was the last time he had a drink. I guess he was about 43 then. I still really didn't connect it to the war, although I always felt sort of sorry for him, and my mom did tell me stories about what my dad was like when he came back from the war and how changed he was and the horrible nightmares he would have. So I did have a sense that the war had some impact on that, but, it wasn't a popular culture. So children of veterans of that war, really, we thought we were isolated, we thought we were sort of alone. Then he ended up being married to a second wife for about 10 years, and then they divorced, and she ended up, after their divorce, committing suicide. Right around that same time, I had a younger sister, and she was killed in an accident on Thanksgiving in 1973. She was 22. So my dad, flew back from California, obviously, and brokenhearted, and thankfully, my parents were at that point supportive of each other because the divorce had been sort of rocky. He didn't drink again. He ended up leaving the Army and counterintelligence. Went to he had some college courses under his belt, but finished college out in California. And ended up coming back to Philadelphia and getting a graduate degree from Temple in psychology, and ended up going into the field of alcohol and drug rehabilitation, and ended up for the rest of his career being the director of drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs, first in the Philadelphia area, then out in California. His last job before he retired was at a military base, Fort Irwin in California, directing the drug and alcohol rehab program for young soldiers. So it was full circle, really.
After his experiences in D-Day, he served in Operation Market Garden and Battle of the Bulge. Did he ever tell you about any of those stories from that time?
He had been, written about in a number of books. And I called my dad. I said, Dad, everybody else has written about you. I never have. So I'd like to start, I'd like to write about it. And he said, well, Carol, you really need to do it from your point of view. You really need to do it as a child of a World War II veteran. You need to talk about my war, but also about how it affected you. And that's when I started really questioning him about the war in detail. He started talking, and he said to me, I want to thank you for doing this. because I think he knew I finally understood all like sort of the turmoil and sadness and everything. After he died, I contacted the archives of Cornelius Ryan, and they sent me all the interview material and notes that Cornelius Ryan had on my dad, and I also contacted the Veterans Administration because my dad, I know, had been trying to get help for decades, and he kept appealing and when they turned him down, and he said they either want me to give up or die, and I'm not going to, because he finally got compensation for PTSD when he was 80. So I knew there were VA files, so I contacted them, and they said, well, the first 200 pages are free, but then it's 2 cents a page. I said, well, how many pages are there? They said 1,000. I go, okay. So they sent me boxes, and I was able to read through like the psychiatric designations that they gave World War II veterans back then. My dad started in 1946 to try to get help. Some of the designations were like anxiety neurosis, inability to digest wartime experiences, alcoholism, but nothing like, there wasn't PTSD. So one of the psychiatrists said, there's basically not much future for this man. That's like, okay. So it really gave me sort of the timeline of his trying to get psychiatric help from the VA, which it wasn't until, much later, after PTSD had been a diagnosis and after Vietnam, veterans brought it to the forefront. And I think the psychiatrist who finally approved it, had known of my dad from the books and, the movie. He was aware of who he was, right? And that he had fought in some of the bloodiest battles. So then he did finally get that, and I guess they gave him some back benefits too. So that's when I started reading the material in the Cornelius Ryan files, especially, I started to realize like how horrible it was, because he was talking honestly to these authors who were interviewing him and asking him direct questions. And it took me, as I said, I came to the realization while he was still alive, but it took me a number of years basically getting the book together and doing the research, because being an academic lawyer, I wanted to also have documentation. And I also wanted to review journal articles and any kind of sources I could about the treatment of World War II veterans after the homecoming. And what surprised me is not that many were actually in combat situations. They said about 25% of American troops were in combat areas and exposed to combat, even if they were support troops. But really, it was probably 10% or 15% that were actually in extended combat. So that's probably why sort of the image of the well-adjusted greatest generation warrior came from, because not everybody saw as much combat,
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Carol Schultz, who is talking about her World War II veteran father's PTSD. Would you say that your father had PTSD, despite there being no diagnosis back, in the 40s? Did he have it pretty much straight after the war, would you say?
My mother said he did. I mean, my mom told stories of how he would basically, she said on their honeymoon, like, they didn't know each other very well. He met her, I think right before he went into paratrooper training. He had come up to Philadelphia with a friend of his who was on leave, because they had a short leave and he wasn't going to go to California because his parents moved there by that point. And he met my mom on that leave, and basically I think it was like love at first sight for them. And then they wrote during the war, but they didn't know each other that well. But when he came back, he got back here in December of 45, early December of 45, and then they got married on December 22nd of 45. And she said that they were taking the train to go out to California to meet his parents, coming from coming from Philadelphia, and she said he was having a bad dream, and he was trying to open a train window, and he was saying, there they are, like, like seeing lights in the distance and thinking maybe it was the Germans. She said he had horrible, horrible nightmares where he jumped out of bed and, in his sleep and say, where's my gun? And, go running down the steps. And she said he would sweat so profusely that the bed was soaked, like everything was soaked because of his horrible nightmares. So, and she said, I mean, not that they knew each other super well, but she said before he went, overseas, he was very happy-go-lucky. And his personality was sort of that way anyhow. I mean, the war had obviously an impact, but he was like a goofy, silly kind of guy with his kids, he would play around with us. And so you could tell that his basic personality was a pretty happy-go-lucky kind of guy, but she said, like, the war, he came back a changed man.
When did you start to notice the PTSD in your father?
After my parents' divorce. I remember as a kid, there was a bar across the street, and I remember as a kid, he used to go over to the bar, and he used to get 2 quart bottles of beer in a paper bag and bring them home. I guess during the evening, he'd have like beer, but he was never like, he was at work every day. He was in counterintelligence at that point in Philadelphia in the Frankfurt Arsenal, so he was domestic intelligence. He would drink his beer, and that was about it. But after my parents' divorce, he really went downhill, and he basically sometimes would show up. He would see us on weekends, and a few times he showed up drunk. I remember my 16th birthday party, he came in drunk. I had the party down in the basement, right? And my mom had been like sort of frisking the boys before they came in to make sure they didn't have any liquor. And my dad comes into the party drunk. So that wasn't the most enjoyable evening. Honestly, that phone call where he said he was going to kill himself, because years later, when I was out visiting him, and we were sitting outside waiting for the car to take me to the airport, and I said to him, Dad, do you remember that phone call that you made when Bardell had slit her wrist, and you said you were going to join her? I said, what were you going to do? Were you going to slit your wrist? He said, no, I had a loaded gun next to me. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
So, I didn't realize that. I just realized that I had to, at that point, like, talk him down and say, no, Dad, you haven't been horrible. But, we didn't have the term PTSD to like, I knew he had problems. I knew that the war had changed him, and that was about as far as it went, at that point. I knew that something about the war had changed who he was before the war, according to what my mom told me. And she said, I loved your father, but I couldn't live with him anymore. But I guess when she divorced him, he lost his anchor. And then, basically he said, he wanted his family, he wanted his girls. My generation was Vietnam, and then I had friends coming back like that. And then I started to realize, well, maybe that's what my dad had.
As an adolescent, when you're kind of seeing these changes in your father, how did that make you feel? Kind of going from this, happy-go-lucky father, to kind of where he was at? Confused,
sad, but at the same time, I was good at compartmentalizing. And, in the 60s, it wasn't real common for working-class girls, because my mom was a hairdresser, and we were in a working-class neighborhood. Back then, it wasn't real common for girls who were like me to go to college, and I was determined that I was going to sort of, like, get there one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So I think I sort of repressed my emotions a lot, and, when I look back now, I think I was slightly depressed, and I was definitely repressed in terms of dealing with actually how bad I felt about it. My younger sister had a much harder time. She was more affected by it. She was younger when they got divorced. I had more years of, like, his fathering, So I had I think a stronger base, and she didn't, and it really affected her more, and she was more emotional about it, and I think it led her to make some bad choices in boyfriends and men. And partly the person that she was with when she died, he died on as a passenger on his motorcycle, and he was sort of a reckless type of guy, and he wasn't. He had other negative qualities too, but she made some poor choices, and part of me feels that some of what happened in our family led to some of those circumstances. Because that definitely affected her a lot.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Carol Schultz, who is talking about her World War II veteran father's PTSD. Before PTSD was really understood, how did you and your family members go about trying to help your father?
Well, I was young. I mean, like when he finally stopped drinking, and when he went out to California, I was like 16, 17. So there wasn't really much that I could do except I just tried to be supportive of him. My mom would get upset with him and my sister would get upset, but I just was always sort of like supporting him. And I don't know. I mean, I think one of the biggest helps was his paratrooper buddy, because when my mom divorced him, my dad went to live in, and I didn't know this because his paratrooper friend Joe was my sister's godfather, and he was always a steady guy and really good to our family. And I didn't know that the reason why my dad went to live with Joe and his wife and 3 children before he married his second wife about 4 years later was because Joe had told me after my father died, I would see Joe periodically. We would go out to lunch, and he said that my father was living in an apartment by the Frankfurt Arsenal where they worked, and he didn't show up for work one day, and they went over to try and find him, and he got into his apartment, and he was passed out with the gas stove on without the burner being on. So I don't know if that was a suicide attempt or whether Joe said we talked among ourselves, the men, and said someone has to take him, someone has to do something. So I think Joe was like this really steady support because he had been in combat too. He wasn't in D-Day. He said when he got off the ship in England, the headlines were saying D-Day invasion begins, so he had just missed D-Day, but he was there after D-Day and was good friends with my dad. So I think it took somebody else who was actually in the war to really help him. And my mom's family, she was a daughter of Italian immigrants. And my grandfather had died when my mother was 2, so I never knew my grandfather. But my grandmother was, sort of like somewhat old-fashioned Italian, and she was not really crazy about the fact that my mom married somebody who was from, far away. My mom married him, like, quickly. And my grandma would call my father the Medicant, with her accent, with her Italian accent, like we weren't all Americans, but he was different to her. And my grandmother would sort of always criticize my dad, and especially after the divorce. And I remember my mother saying, "Stop it, Mom, it's their father." But so I can't say that he was getting a whole lot of family support from the Italian, like his in-laws, but I'm sure when he went out to California and lived with his parents, he was getting a lot of support then, because they were, that's when he went back to school on the GI Bill, and I guess he was living with them for a while, and they were helping him out. Because my grandfather, his father, my grandfather Fred, had been a Marine in World War I and was a survivor of Belleau Wood, which was a sort of a bloody battle of World War I. From what my aunts on my paternal aunts told me, that my grandfather Fred had pretty bad nightmares and everything. So I think going out there and my grandmother having nursed these men when they came back, they had much more of a better understanding. And that's when he started going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings every night when he was out there. And he had tried AA before in Philadelphia, off and on, because I remember they would have like a family night, or they would have like Alateen, and I went to some meetings. But I think it was going out with my grandparents and being with his parents who sort of understood what he went through.
When was your father officially diagnosed with PTSD?
It was really only a couple years before he died, I think. I think it was like early 2000s, maybe.
Did that offer any closure for you and him, like on why he might have been acting, why he was acting?
Well, I think we sort of knew before. I mean, he was constantly appealing the fact that he wasn't getting diagnosed with it. I think we knew he had it before that, you know. I think for him and for me, too, it was finally satisfaction that he finally got that recognition, and then he didn't give up fighting to get it. He spent like his whole lifetime after the war trying to get it.
How can a family member effectively help someone that does have PTSD?
Well, I think nowadays there's a lot more awareness of what happens when someone returns from war. And I think that, first of all, you have to be sort of sympathetic and understanding of what they're going through. Not to say that my mother wasn't, but she was doing it in a vacuum. And I think you have to do everything you can to try to get help for them. If you're not getting it from the Veterans Administration, you have to try to get it from, it's like a private therapist. I gave a talk at a World War I lecture series at a library in the Philadelphia area, and there was a young man there who was a veteran of Iraq and who had, I guess, served 3 tours and had lost some good friends there. He and I became friendly, and he asked me to, after he read my book, he asked me to come to a couple meetings with him. He wasn't able to get the help from the VA that he needed, so he found a private therapist who was a Vietnam veteran, and he asked me to come to a couple of therapy sessions with him just to sort of explain, what I had gone through as a child of someone with PTSD. So I think that you have to sort of just really encourage them to get any kind of help that they can, and to basically, I think there's more support groups now too.
How was your dad towards the end of his life with his PTSD? Was he in a better place?
Yeah, I think because he felt like he helped a lot of young men. He was working at that drug and alcohol rehab program at the military base. I think that gave him satisfaction that he was able to turn around his life and what he had gone through to help people who were going through it after him. I remember at his, he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and at his funeral there was a young man who he had helped out at Fort Irwin who got up to speak at the funeral, and he started crying, and he said, "Dutch Schultz saved my life," in terms of, I guess, getting him sober and everything. And that was basically, he said that when I sort of broke down at the funeral because he was crying so much. It was so I think he got satisfaction, and also over the years, I mean, my sister's death was a blow for all of us. But over the years, my dad and I, just really reconnected the way we were when I was a kid, because I was close to him as a kid. I would go out to California. Firstly, after my sister died, I'd go out to California every summer for 2 or 3 weeks. And then when I had my daughter, I started taking her out from the time she was 3 years old. And we'd spend 3 weeks or so out in California with him and his wife. And I think that was real important to him to sort of to be able to reconnect at the level that we had when I was younger, because my mom always said, the only reason I was worried about the divorce is because you were so close to your dad. And I was, my sister was closer to my mother, but I was really close to my dad. And I remember one of the last times that I left, it was that time when he mentioned about the gun. And then he said, he looked at me and he said, I did a good job. And then he looked again and he said, well, your mother and I did a good job with you. So it was I think he felt that satisfaction that, I had turned out okay, and we were still close. And, he basically, I was sort of proud of him, the way he turned his life around. So, and I think he was proud of me by the fact that I just kept forging ahead. After he died, people would tell me that they said, oh, he would brag about you. He would say, my daughter's a PhD with a law degree, and she's remarkable, and she's so smart. And I never knew that, right? It's I never knew he'd be bragging about me, but he knew that I just sort of he would always say, Carol, one foot in front of the other. And I think he saw himself in me, maybe, because there were obstacles and there were tough times in my life, but I just kept sort of forging ahead,
For those interested in your book, The Hidden Legacy of World War II, A Daughter's Journey of Discovery, where can we get it?
It's on Amazon. It's also, you can get it through Sunbury Press, but Amazon's probably the easiest way to get it. It's both, it's both print and Kindle.
Okay. Well, it was great having you on the show today, Carol.
I really enjoyed it. You asked wonderful questions, and I really appreciate you having me on the show.
My guest today was Carol Schultz, talking about her World War II veteran father's PTSD journey. Tune in next week, where we speak with a Vietnam veteran about their journey with PTSD. And if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.